If you were to say who was like the most influential conservative politician of like those 14 years of government, ultimately it wouldn't be someone like Cameron or Osborne or Boris Johnson or anyone like that. It would be probably Michael Gove. And I think you could argue that very, very successfully. Even now, remember who introduced Kimmy Badnock to the world? It was Michael Gove. He introduced her 2 cycles ago to the world when she first ran as this literally no one and had massive backing from Michael Gove. There is still talks going on at this moment in the Conservative Party about how much power he actually has over Kimmy Badnock, and is he actually doing some puppet master stuff from the background? Now, that is, very, very much in doubt. But how much influence does he have on Kimmy Badnock? We don't know. Does he have any influence on Kimmy Badnock? Is also a question we should ask. But is without a doubt, Kimmy Badnock would not be where she is without Michael Gove's backing. Not only that, but Michael Gove still remains one of the most influential voices in like the conservative sphere. So when he says stuff, you should probably listen because it will give you a clue as to just probably how bad things are going on in the party. Because right now there is a movement that suggests that the only reason they lost the last election was that they just weren't conservative enough. And don't worry, Britain is yearning for conservative rule and they'll be back. Meanwhile, of course, we just did that article about, well, those 2 pieces about, why we lost. And they still can't understand why they lost. you know? But yeah, we're going to go have a look at this because this is kind of interesting. Because here, Michael Gove gives some advice to Kimmy Badnock. And I think it's kind of interesting why he's giving this advice, especially at a moment where there is now talk that the Conservatives may very well try to bring back Boris Johnson. I do not kid that. There has been this, we've talked about this before, this undercurrent of bring back Johnson, bring back Johnson. Well, apparently a lot of them are now like, yeah, we should just bring back Johnson. Hey, I know people accuse me of like, oh, you won't cover Labour. Why should I ignore this craziness that's going on in this other party? It's insane. And guess what? You want to hear all that stuff? Go to those other people. But it's my channel. I'll cover what I want. So, you don't have to watch me. But if you do, you can click the subscribe button. Like I say, I'm not your dad. So, as always, click the like, click the share button, and of course, down below there's the subscribe button. There is, of course, the Patreon page. There's the Buy Me Coffee link where you can buy me coffee. There's the YouTube thank you button. There's all that good stuff down below. So, as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help and support the channel. So, we're going on into this because this is just, oh my word. Yeah, Michael Gove, is he the power behind the throne? Is he like a big conservative mover and shaker? Yes, but to what extent? That is always the question. So this comes from The Independent with the title of Michael Gove explains why he abandoned Boris Johnson twice. So Michael Gove was the most consequential minister of the past 14 years of Conservative government. And it could easily be argued, I would say easily, I would add that to that, that without him, Britain would have stayed in the European Union. He paved the way for Boris Johnson to lead the Leave campaign in the referendum, and despite having twice stood unsuccessfully for the party leadership, he also has had a very substantial record as a reforming minister of the education, justice, and levelling up. Again, very true. Leveling up, I would say, not so much. Certainly education. That can be argued. Justice, again, maybe not so much, but I think certainly his education is really his star point. Other than that, justice, leveling up, certainly not. But back to this. So, as the editor, of course, for The Spectator, he will obviously continue to be very influential in the Tory politics. So, it is very worth hearing what he has to say just last Thursday to the students that I teach at King's College London, when he gave this term's final class in the quote conservative years module taught by Dr. Jack Brown. He offered a very brief summary of the period of Tory turmoil, ending in an honest assessment of why it ended, with Liz Truss's mini budget in 2022 being the point of no return, saying, I think this was, even more than Partygate, the single greatest blot on the Conservative record, he said. The fact that people still, in real time, saw the cost of their mortgages rise, we saw the country enter a period of economic instability, wreck the Conservative reputation, such as it was for economic management. But far more than that, the fact what it was we the Conservatives, our members and our MPs who said this person is ready to be Prime Minister. The fact that just after 40 days, people thought, what were you smoking? And yeah, he's not wrong. He's really not wrong on that assessment. He gets that very, very much right. And that is, again, a reason why they lost. Like, you told us, your members, although we've been predicting it for a while on this channel, that this person was like ready to be the leader, ready to like lead the country. And yet in 40 days, absolute disaster, shortest serving prime minister ever. And like I say, if the Queen hadn't died when she had, I think there is every argument it could have been even less than that, because she gained a lot of time from the Queen dying. Like, there was just 2 weeks where obviously where sort of the Queen died and there was the whole funeral where it was just like not a lot of stuff going on. It was sort of like, they'd hit the pause button. Like I say, I think should have lasted even shorter had the Queen not died at that point. So that meant, of course, that whoever took over, even though it's, of course, Rishi Sunak, who had predicted that, of course, this would all end in tears, they would be on a losing wicket. Just as Gove had stood down from the Parliament, the Conservative Party suffered its worst defeat in history. He continued saying, we are now, of course, with Keir Starmer, having, of course, promised change, said Gove. As a result of change, we are now, what we have now is a government that is committed to austerity, staying close to a Republican president, increasing defense spending, and seeing more children going into poverty. So, as you can see, a radical shift from the preceding 14 years. Anyway, one of the students, of course, did ask Gove what he thought the party should do now. And he admitted it would be, quote, very, very difficult for the Conservatives to actually recover. The last time they were in opposition, it took the Conservatives 3 elections before they actually found a leader and the platform that actually got them into government. In 2010, he said the requirements for the Conservatives to get into government were just 1, Tony Blair to be replaced, and 2, policies on the economy and public sector that did not look as though they were exclusively favoring the wealthier. And 3, the ownership of policies that were about our signified altruism. So David Cameron's embracing of the green politics was both an important in itself and the issue now rising up the salience in people's minds. But also, this is a policy is about our children. Again, not wrong on that. Not wrong on that. Like I say, this is why so many Conservatives are just ditching this stuff, because they don't care about a lot of that stuff. They really do not care. And now, of course, he said the difficulties the current Conservative Party face have and are now linked to their perceptions of incompetence. But how can you actually prove that you're competent unless and until you are back in office? He said that, of course, Kimi Badnoch, as his protege, as Tory leader, needs to take drastic action to try and change that perception of the party. Although he phrased it as something that, quote, conservative leaders, so even Michael Gove doesn't think she's got long, plural, should do, implying that there may be many more before the Tories actually win again. He also thought that they would, of course, not take his advice. But he said, what I think the Conservative leaders should do, but what I think they will not happen is, of course, is that they should say, I'm so sorry about Liz Truss's mini budget. And do you know why we got it wrong? We got it wrong because we preferred ideology and self-regarded to the reality and thinking about the whole country. That will never happen again, and I'm going to change the ways in which leaders are elected in order to ensure that that doesn't. Um, Holy moly! What is one of the biggest things I've said about the Conservative Party over these years? It is their adherence to ideology. That is, as long as they go on this ideological path, if anything goes wrong or anything like that, it's not the ideology, it must be something else. But holy moly, Gove shockingly getting it right there. Again, I think Michael Gove would actually be kind of a fascinating conversation. Like, he would be a fascinating conversation. He really would be, I think. In other words, he would take, of course, the right time to choose the party leader away from the members and restore it to just the MPs alone, as was the norm before William Hague now widened that franchise back in 1998 to defend himself against a challenge, of course, from Michael Portillo, of whom, incidentally, Gove wrote a very admiring biography. Yep. And now that very system was the one that was very, very much responsible for choosing ever more crazy, right-wing, lunatic MPs, and that you have seen since that point. That is actually something, if you are serious about, quote, fixing like the Conservative Party, you actually have to do that. You actually have to do that. That is something we've talked about before. That if you were, going to try and fix the Conservative Party, you would have to do that. But doing that, taking all that power away from the members, bear in mind, what's the whole crazy right wing of the Conservative Party want? They want even more power over the selection process, taking even more away from MPs. Yep. Like I say, wild times happening in the Conservative Party, that's for sure. Anyway, it continues. As for, of course, his own leadership ambitions, Gove was, of course, asked why he withdrew his support from Johnson after the referendum. He said, I had convinced myself towards the end of the referendum campaign that Boris had moved away from being Prince Hal to Henry V, and had moved from being the jester to the heir presumptive and even the potential monarch, Gove said. But without warning and going into too much detail in the days that followed, Boris reverted back into a far more chaotic figure than I had even hoped that he would had at least have managed to at least transcend. And there were a variety of things that I would have at least anticipated that someone would have done if they were, of course, on the brink of becoming prime minister. If that prize was there, he didn't do it. And he seemed disinclined to do so. And what that was, bear in mind, was the fact that a lot of the Conservatives always looked to the time of Boris when he was mayor of London. Why was Boris so a successful mayor of London where he wasn't a successful prime minister? Partly because he surrounded himself, or shall we say, had it foisted upon him, people who are actually competent. Now, there were still gaffes and stuff that went on during his time. There's an absolute collection of them, of that happening. But when he was prime minister, he chose his own cabinet. He chose the yes man. He chose the people who would always agree with him, and he chose no one that would outshine him. You may remember, of course, the rumors that he was going to get rid of Rishi Sunak because Rishi Sunak was becoming more popular than him, if you remember, during the pandemic. And yet, this is the guy that people think they now want to bring back. But again, Gove called it right on Boris, getting that right. But he continues. He said, "So I thought, you cannot say at this stage to the country, this man is, of course, ready to be prime minister. Now, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, I should probably have said that and just reiterated and, of course, withdrew rather than putting myself forward. But at that time, it struck me as you can't just say, oh, well, he's not suitable, and then not provide an answer. All I would say is that sometimes politicians, like everyone, can indulge in wishful thinking. And sometimes politicians, like everyone, can find that after a period of exhaustion and adrenaline, their judgment is impaired." I think that's a very honest thing to say. I think that is a very honest thing for Gove to say. I will tell you what, I'll give him a point for that because I think that sentence, yeah, I think that's right. I think that is very right on that one. Gove, of course, then turned against Johnson a second time after Johnson had been Prime Minister for 3 years. But, of course, he offered a plea in mitigation on Johnson's behalf over Partygate, saying that Boris is not someone who is naturally gregarious. Boris is not someone who thought, brilliant, nobody knows what goes on behind the black door, party, party, party. Boris generally believed that what he was doing was legit, strictly necessary for work purposes. And when he did do it, he was taking the trouble to say, look, these rules that I've just told everyone about, it would appear that we are, quote, not really, hold on a moment. Like I say, Gove is certainly someone who knows Boris Johnson very well. You can tell he's got his mannerisms, talking points down very well to a T there. Johnson's mistake, Gove thought, was to at least continue to insist that the rules had been followed. Boris's governing style was that of someone who is, of course, a gambler, and prime ministers often are. And his gambles, a lot of the time, did come off. Then eventually, one gamble led to one too many to his fall. Gove was, of course, asked of which of the 5 prime ministers of that period was the best in managing the civil service. Which one of them would have been best at least handling the coronavirus pandemic? In both cases, his answer was David Cameron. But he also said that Tony Blair had been very influential during the pandemic, that the Labour former prime minister at least pressed for a policy of first doses first for the vaccines, widening, of course, the gap between the 2 doses. Thus, of course, maximizing the numbers receiving and, of course, the greater protection from the first dose. As a result, both, of course, being very influential and pressing for some of the very things that which he had argued, he had helped now to overdo his rival in his political reputation. He said, in my lifetime, the single most impressive politician in the English-speaking world has been Tony Blair. I've always said Michael Gove was, of course, the real heir to Blair and should have been Prime Minister instead of Boris Johnson. I think he would have had just as many problems, I think. How Gove would have been Prime Minister, probably, greatest what if questions of our time. I don't think Gove will ever be Prime Minister. I don't think he'll ever come back because the current Conservative Party hates politicians in that cloth that Gove is cut. They hate them with a passion. They call them the wets. There is the very part that the most current now. Once again, the right wing is very, very much entering control of the party, and they don't seem to realize that they're once again taking the wheel off the edge of the cliff. And this time, there will be no coming back. Like, there will be no coming back from I think the cliff they are about to go down into. This is another reason why I am following this stuff, so that when it eventually happens, I can go, hey, remember when we were talking about this? Remember when we were talking about this? Remember when we were talking about this? Yeah, it's all adding up. It's all adding up. And as I said back in the day, eventually there will come someone, and that person maybe will be Michael Gove, who is like, like we've had, and we've seen David Gauke as well, sounding, the siren call of what are you doing? This is a disaster. And of course, what are they being treated as? They're being treated as absolute pariahs, being pushed into like the political wilderness because they are not interested in speaking to those people. And eventually, I will tell you this now, not anytime soon, but eventually, there's a lot of people who are going to turn around and just say, well, actually, people like Gove and Gork, they were right. So it's always very interesting to see things like this and where potentially this will go. Still a lot of stuff going on. The May local elections, I think, are going to be very bad for the Tories. I think you're probably going to see, like I said before, a lot of Lib Dem wins. We'll see what happens to Reform. Of course, they will win some seats. Will they surpass the UKIP day numbers at their height? I don't think so. But yeah, interesting times indeed for that party. But they're on another collision course, and this time, if they go off the cliff, there is no coming back for them. At least either A, not for a very long time, or you've got to have a Superman swoop in and save the party that way. And I'll tell you now, I can't tell you if there is such an individual, but you've got people like Michael Gove and Gork who are like, we are going straight towards a cliff. You need to put the brakes on. And by the time someone realizes that they are right and that the stuff they've been saying is correct, it'll be too late. The disaster will have already happened. So, as always, let me know what you think down below. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.